wages. There is no such thing as a class mentality. But when men live in a mixed economy, as they do today, the incentives for them to rise are getting less and less, and the difficulties, the obstacles, more and more. So that if you take them in that period of flux, you might find that a great many men today would feel, what's the difference, whether the state or a boss employs me, I have no chance anyway. But that type of psychology is the product of a mixed economy, meaning a society on its way down towards a dictatorship. This is not the normal psychology of the majority of men. The majority of men, not being initiators or originators intellectually, react according to the society in which they live. If they have a chance to function at their best, they will. If not, they give up. But the fault there is in the system, not in human nature.
Mr. Gandolfi.
Ms. Rand, since 1958, there were 40,000 millionaires in this country. In 1965, there are close to 100,000 millionaires. This has all happened despite a very heavy tax structure. Since the number of people who have become owners of their own business has increased so markedly, how is it that we still maintain in the popular press and in most works the idea that avenues open to people today no longer exist, that the idea that the time of the self-made man or the man who could rise by his own abilities is limited and has passed?
This type of argument is very dangerous. Statistics never prove anything until and unless you define just exactly what you mean by a given set of statistics, under what circumstances and what context it was taken. For instance, the number of millionaires obviously wouldn't mean anything, since to become a millionaire 20 years ago or 50 years ago took much more than it does today. Today, we observe popular expressions and go into $1 billion, not $1 million. So the $1 million baby today would be kind of cheap. One would have to say, you look like $1 billion. And if you notice, that type of inflation is already taking place in popular expression. A million made today does not mean as much, does not require as much effort as it did years ago, because the money is cheaper. We'll buy less. But that is not the point. The real point is this, that so long as there is an element of freedom, man will rise and will succeed. But the real issue is to observe what amount of effort is required of men in proportion to what type or degree of achievement. And it is unmistakably true that it is much harder today to achieve anything by individual effort than it was, let us say, the turn of the century. A man who then, using his intelligence and ability, might become a multimillionaire, let us say, today will be fortunate if he gets to open his own small business. It is true that it is much harder for men to rise today, because the rise must be measured not merely in terms of financial income, but in terms of the nature of the achievement, the nature of the independence, and of the advantage that a man accomplishes, granting a certain ability and effort. Now, the issue of the age of individual achievement being passed, if I understand your argument correctly, you are citing this statistic to indicate that the age of achievement is not passed, but it isn't by means of statistics that you can demonstrate it. Because it is true that it is harder today, but what you have to analyze is why is it harder? And the difficulty does not lie in the technological development or in the spread of the complexity of scientific discovery. The difficulty lies in the growth of controls. It is hard today for an individual achievement, not because science or the development of industry makes it harder, but big government, that is the growth of the powers of government, the growth of controls, that makes an individual achievement today almost impossible, or harder than it had been in a freer or semi-free period of American history. The idea that science is a threat to individualism in economics has to be refuted on its own terms, and it is a blatant contradiction. Observe in what way? If a primitive, non-industrial economy could not be run successfully by government controls, and freedom was required to create industry in the first place, to create the Industrial Revolution, by what reasoning would one say that a developed industry, a highly complex technological industry, must be run by slave labor? That slave labor is impractical in a pre-industrial economy, but becomes practical in a complex scientific technological economy. And of course, the best practical illustration of that is the failure, the abysmal failure, I underscore, of a country like Soviet Russia and of every type of dictatorship when they take over an industrial or semi-industrial society. After 50 years, which is half a century, Russia is still unable to feed her population. Compare that to the progress made in the same 50 years in America and in other semi-free economies. Compare the difference in the development of East Germany and West Germany since World War II, and it's there that you have the evidence and the proof and the argument for the superiority of a free economy which is required by an industrial age more so than at any other time.
Mr. Gandolfi.
What I wanted to illustrate by those statistics was that many people today oppose capitalism not because of its material deficiencies, but because they want to somehow justify their own failure to live up to their own to achieve their own values. And if they believe that it is impossible for man to succeed today, then it is an excuse for their own failure.
Oh, I see. Well, this is true, but what is more true is that they are afraid of the independence and the freedom that capitalism requires. What I mentioned in my opening remarks. People who do not want the responsibility of functioning independently blame capitalism and say that capitalism makes it impossible, or capitalism is gone. The development of science requires that we go now to statism, and therefore capitalism is obsolete. What they are really rationalizing is their own fear of independence. So that is what is involved in arguments of this type.
Mr. Hood.
Ms. Rand, we hear a shocking amount of talk these days about a guaranteed income. So-called conservative economist has advocated this position. A group of businessmen have advocated it. And it seems to be coming from a group, originating from a group called the Committee on the Triple Revolution. And they claim that because of automation and computers, the necessity for work and for capitalism, which is a work-oriented society, is becoming a thing of the past. What is the true root of these proposals?
The true root of these proposals is plain, vicious, inexcusable ignorance. Either ignorance and or fraud, and there is nothing more to be said about it. Because the idea that work will become unnecessary is only proof of the total ignorance of what constitutes a complex industrial economy. The idea that machines will run themselves proves that whoever makes such claims has never looked at industry and has never done a day's work. Obviously, the higher the industrial development, the more complex the machine, the more is required of the workers. The accusation that automation threatens incomes or will throw people out of work was made at every turning point in the history of the Industrial Revolution. I will just remind you of the workers who were smashing England's textile factories when they were first introduced. And what has history proved? that the introduction of new technology creates wider opportunities for jobs and requires a larger workforce. There will never be a time when machines will do the work of men. Those who claim it merely confess their own psychology. It may be true that machines could replace them, but no one will ever invent a vicious machine of that kind.